Welcome to AZ-802, Practice Exam, Monitoring and Troubleshooting Deep Dive, Set 9. This focus session includes 50 original questions on Windows Server monitoring, Azure Monitor, performance diagnostics, connectivity, updates, storage, Active Directory recovery, replication, Kerberos, and secure channels. I will read each monitoring or troubleshooting scenario and the answer choices. After the choices, you will hear, "Lock in your answer." Then the video pauses for a silent 3-second countdown. Pause the video if you need more time. After the countdown, I will reveal the correct answer, explain the deciding signal, isolation step, diagnostic tool, or remediation boundary, and share one exam clue you can transfer to another scenario. Question 1 of 50. Users report that an on-premises application server becomes unresponsive for several minutes at unpredictable times. By the time an engineer opens Task Manager, CPU utilization has returned to normal. The engineer needs evidence that identifies the process consuming CPU during the next occurrence, while keeping collection overhead low. What should the engineer configure? Option A. Run a long-running performance monitor collection that includes process %%, processor time, processor %%, processor time, system % processor queue length, and system switches per second. Option B. Leave the real-time performance monitor graph open with only the processor % total, %processor time counter. Option C. Use Resource Monitor after users report the next occurrence and review its current CPU process list. Option D. Configure Task Manager to show the server's cumulative CPU time column and review it at the end of each week. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Run a long-running performance monitor collection that includes process star processor time, processor star processor time, system processor queue length, and system "indebted per second." A long-running performance monitor collection preserves counter data across the unpredictable incident interval. Process instances identify the consumer, while processor utilization, queue length, and context switches provide the surrounding CPU contention evidence. Microsoft Learn specifically recommends long-running performance monitor collection when a sporadic high CPU event is gone before an engineer can observe it interactively. When a performance symptom disappears before interactive tools are opened, choose interval-based counterlogging that includes both the suspected resource and per-process attribution. Question 2 of 50. An engineer must establish a 7-day baseline for a domain controller. ADDS, LDAP, processor, and disk counters must be sampled every 60 seconds from 0800 through 1800, and the results must remain available as local binary log files for later comparison. Which configuration best meets the requirement? Option A. Create a performance monitor custom view containing the counters and save the view on the domain controller. Option B. Create a user-defined data collector set with the counters and 60-second sample interval. Configure its local output directory and assign the required schedule and run as credentials. Option C. Create an Azure Monitor data collection rule for the counters and associate it with the domain controller. Option D. Create a performance monitor report and configure the report to begin collecting the counters each morning. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Create a user-defined data collector set with the counters and 60-second sample interval. Configure its local output directory and assign the required schedule and run as credentials. A user-defined data collector set defines the counters, sample interval, output format and location, and scheduled collection window. Its execution identity must have the required rights to collect data and write to the destination. The resulting .blg data can be reviewed later under Performance Monitor Reports or loaded directly for comparison. A requirement combining named counters, a sample interval, a schedule, and local .blg output points to a user-defined data collector set, rather than a view, report, or Azure DCR. Question 3 of 50. A company manages 50 on-premises Windows servers through Windows Admin Center. The operations team wants a consolidated performance view and email notification when a server sustains high CPU utilization. No server is currently connected to Azure Monitor. What should the engineer do from Windows Admin Center first? Option A. Create a local performance monitor alert data collector set on each server and configure the Windows Admin Center gateway as its SMTP relay. Option B. Enable event subscriptions on the Windows Admin Center gateway and forward each server's system log to the gateway. Option C. Register Windows Admin Center with Azure. Onboard the servers to Azure Monitor and a log analytics workspace, and then use the Azure portal link to configure the alert and its email action. Option D. Add the servers to a Windows Admin Center connection list and create a shared CPU threshold in the Overview tool without connecting a workspace. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Register Windows Admin Center with Azure, onboard the servers to Azure Monitor and a log analytics workspace, and then use the Azure portal link to configure the alert and its email action. Windows Admin Center's Azure Monitor integration requires Azure registration and onboarding the managed servers to a log analytics workspace. After onboarding, the servers send performance data to Azure Monitor. The Windows Admin Center Azure Monitor tool links to the Azure portal to create alerts and email actions. Using one workspace also enables a consolidated multi-server view. In Windows Admin Center, consolidated hybrid performance and email alerting require Azure registration plus workspace onboarding before alert configuration. Question 4 of 50. A Windows Server 2022 file server is isolated from the internet by policy. Storage consumption has increased unevenly for several months, and an engineer must forecast whether its local volumes are approaching capacity. The forecast data must remain on the server. Which solution should the engineer use? Option A. Create a performance monitor threshold alert that fires when current free space falls below 15%. Option B. Use File Server Resource Manager storage reports to list the largest files and infer the future exhaustion date. Option C. Install the Azure Monitor agent and create a DCR that sends logical disk counters to a log analytics workspace. Option D. Enable System Insights volume consumption forecasting and review its locally generated predictions. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Enable System Insights volume consumption forecasting and review its locally generated predictions. System Insights is built into supported Windows Server versions and uses machine learning models against data collected, persisted, and analyzed locally. Its volume consumption capability forecasts storage consumption for each volume, satisfying both the predictive and no cloud connectivity requirements. The combination of predictive capacity analysis and a no-cloud requirement is the signature boundary for System Insights, whose analysis and data stay local. Question 5 of 50. Security analysts review failed sign-ins on domain controllers every morning. The security log currently overwrites older events before the review occurs during busy periods. Analysts need a reusable event viewer view of event ID 4625 and must retain enough source events for the daily review. What should an engineer configure? Option A. Increase the maximum size of the security log and create a custom view filtered to security event ID 4625. Option B. Attach a task to the next 4625 event and delete each matching event after the task runs. Option C. Export the security log once, clear it, and reopen the exported file as the permanent custom view. Option D. Increase the maximum size of the Applications and Services Logs branch and filter its administrative events for ID 4625. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Increase the maximum size of the security log and create a custom view filtered to Security Event ID 4625. Event ID 4625 is recorded in the security log. Increasing that log's maximum size reduces premature overwrite, while a custom view supplies the reusable filter without moving or deleting source records. The view references matching events. Retention is controlled by the source log size and retention behavior. A custom view filters but does not retain events. Preserve the underlying channel by configuring that source log's capacity or retention behavior. Question 6 of 50. Azure Monitor Agent is installed on 30 Azure Arc-enabled Windows servers. A newly created DCR defines processor, memory, and logical disk performance counters and sends them to the required log analytics workspace. No records arrive, although the agents report healthy and the DCR validates successfully. What should the engineer do? Option A. Add the workspace ID and key to the legacy Microsoft Monitoring Agent control panel on each server. Option B. Create data collection rule associations between the DCR and the Arc-enabled server resources. Option C. Move the performance counters from the DCR into a diagnostic setting on each Arc-enabled server. Option D. Create an Azure Monitor Alert processing rule scoped to the DCR. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Create data collection rule associations between the DCR and the Arc-enabled server resources. For Azure Monitor Agent Collection, a data collection rule association links a resource to the DCR. A valid DCR can define sources, transformations, and destinations, but AMA retrieves and applies DCRs associated with its machine. Creating the missing associations enables the servers to collect the specified counters and send them to the workspace. A healthy AMA plus a valid DCR but no data often indicates a missing DCRA, the resource to rule link, not a malformed data source or destination. Question 7 of 50. An operations team must receive both email and SMS notifications when the percentage CPU platform metric for any production Azure VM averages above 80% during a 5-minute window. Which two configuration actions are required? Option A. Create an action group with the operations team's email and SMS receivers. Option B. Create a log search alert whose KQL query counts Windows system events over 5 minutes. Option C. Create a metric alert scoped to the production VMs with percentage CPU, an 80% threshold, and a 5-minute aggregation window. Option D. Create an activity log alert for Microsoft.count/virtual-machines/write operations. Option E. Create an alert processing rule that adds the percentage CPU threshold to all existing alerts. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and C. Option A. Create an action group with the operations team's email and SMS receivers. Option C. Create a metric alert scoped to the production VMs with percentage CPU, an 80% threshold, and a 5-minute aggregation window. The metric alert rule supplies the signal, scope, threshold, aggregation, and evaluation logic. The action group independently supplies the notification receivers and channels. Both are required. The rule determines when the condition is met, and the associated action group sends email and SMS notifications. Separate alert detection from response. The alert rule owns the signal and condition, while the action group owns email, SMS, webhook, or other actions. Question 8 of 50. VM Insights is enabled for an Azure VM that hosts the application tier of a 3-tier service, including processes and dependencies. The performance view shows a memory utilization increase during a reported slowdown. An engineer now needs to see which processes were running and which back-end machines or external processes they communicated with during that time window. Which VM Insights view should the engineer use? Option A. The Azure Activity Log filter to administrative operations on the VM. Option B. Metrics Explorer using only the virtual machine host namespace. Option C. The Map view with the time window set to the slowdown interval. Option D. The VM Insights performance view in the multi-machine top-end perspective. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C, the map view, with the time window set to the slowdown interval. When processes and dependencies are enabled, the VM Insights map view displays running processes and their dependencies on other machines and external processes. Setting its time window to the incident interval lets the engineer inspect the application topology associated with the slowdown after the performance view established the utilization trend. In VM Insights, performance answers how resource use changed, map answers which processes ran and what machines or external processes they depended on. Question 9 of 50. A domain-joined Windows server can reach its default gateway and a domain controller by IP address. Name resolution also returns the domain controller's correct IP address. However, testnet connection to the domain controller on TCP port 445 fails, while the same test from another server on the same subnet succeeds. What should the engineer investigate next? Option A, the DNS zone's host record for the domain controller. Option B, the default gateway configuration on the domain controller. Option C, the physical switch uplink used by the entire subnet. Option D, the failing server's local TCP IP filtering and Windows firewall rules for the SMB connection. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D, the failing server's local TCP IP filtering and Windows firewall rules for the SMB connection. The successful IP test and correct DNS answer rule out basic reachability and name resolution. Another server on the same subnet reaches the same destination and port, which makes a shared path or destination-wide failure unlikely. The remaining discriminating boundary is host-specific filtering or firewall configuration on the failing server. Successful IP reachability plus correct DNS, but failure on one TCP port narrows the fault to transport layer filtering. A working peer on the same subnet further isolates it to the host. Question 10 of 50. A domain-joined member server uses DNS1 as its only DNS server. The server resolves records in the internal AD integrated zone, but internet names time out. Running NSLOOKUP for the same internet name against DNS2 succeeds. DNS1 is configured to use root hints and has no forwarder. Which action should the engineer take on DNS1? Option A, verify and repair DNS1's root hints, copying known good root hints from DNS2 if necessary. Option B, delete and recreate the internal AD integrated zone. Option C, flush only the member server's DNS client cache. Option D, change the member server's primary DNS address to a public DNS resolver. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A, verify and repair DNS1's root hints, copying known good root hints from DNS2 if necessary. Internal resolution proves that the client can query DNS1 and that the internal zone is functioning. DNS2's successful external lookup isolates the problem to DNS1's recursion path. Because DNS1 uses root hints rather than a forwarder, Microsoft guidance is to verify and, when missing or damaged, restore its root hints, including by copying them from another DNS server. When internal names work, but internet recursion fails on one DNS server, test that server directly and inspect its configured recursion mechanism, forwarders or root hints. Question 11 of 50. A Windows Server 2022 application server repeatedly fails to install a cumulative update. Windows Update Client/Operational records the same failure code on each attempt. The server has not been restarted since an earlier servicing operation, and no component store corruption has yet been confirmed. What should the engineer do first? Option A, reset the software distribution and catroot2 folders immediately, then retry the update. Option B, restart the server to clear the pending reboot state, then retry the update and use the recorded failure code if it fails again. Option C, run dism/online/cleanupimage/restore health before reviewing any other servicing state. Option D, Download the package from Microsoft Update Catalog and force its installation with wusa.exe. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Restart the server to clear the pending reboot state, then retry the update and use the recorded failure code if it fails again. Microsoft's troubleshooting sequence starts by identifying the failing update and error in the Windows Update logs, then checking for a pending restart. Because the error is already recorded and the server has a credible pending reboot condition, the least invasive next step is to restart and retry. DISM or an update component reset becomes appropriate only when subsequent evidence points to component store or update component corruption. When an update error is already captured and a restart is pending, clear the pending servicing state before escalating to DISM or resetting update components. Question 12 of 50. Users in an Active Directory domain intermittently receive Kerberos clock skew errors. On several member servers, w32tm/query/source returns a manually configured public NTP host instead of a domain controller. The forest root PDC emulator is already synchronized to an approved external source. Which remediation restores the intended domain time hierarchy? Option A. Configure the member servers to use the PDC emulator's IP address as a manual NTP peer. Option B. Configure every domain controller and member server with the same public NTP peer list. Option C. Configure the affected member servers to use NT5DS domain hierarchy synchronization, then rediscover and resynchronize their time source. Option D. Leave the manual peers configured and increase the Kerberos maximum clock tolerance policy. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Configure the affected member servers to use NT5DS domain hierarchy synchronization, then rediscover and resynchronize their time source. Domain members should normally synchronize through the Active Directory domain hierarchy by using NT5DS. The forest root PDC emulator sits at the top of that hierarchy and can use a reliable external source. Returning members to NT5DS preserves automatic source discovery and avoids hard-coding one domain controller as a peer. A domain member reporting a public NTP source is the key mismatch. Members belong on NT5DS, while the forest root PDC emulator anchors the hierarchy to external time. Question 13 of 50. A Windows Server file server becomes slow for about 20 minutes during an unpredictable nightly processing window. By the time an engineer signs in, Task Manager looks normal. The team needs evidence that can distinguish sustained CPU, memory, storage, and network pressure and identify the responsible process. What should the engineer configure? Option A. A performance monitor alert that records only processor_total%, processor time when it exceeds a threshold. Option B. Resource monitor left open in the administrator's interactive session overnight. Option C. A scheduled export of the system event log at the end of the processing window. Option D. A performance monitor data collector set that continuously records system and per process counters to a bounded circular BLG file. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D, a performance monitor data collector set that continuously records system and per process counters to a bounded circular BLG file. A continuously running data collector set provides historical correlated counters across CPU, memory, disk, network, and processes, even when no engineer is watching. A bounded circular BLG limits disk use while preserving the interval around an intermittent incident. The collected system counters can then be correlated with process counters to isolate the consumer. An intermittent slowdown that is gone when staff connect calls for a flight recorder-style data collector set, not another live snapshot. Question 14 of 50. An Azure Monitor Agent extension deployment to an Azure Arc enabled Windows server ends in failed with only a generic portal message. A proxy change was made earlier that day. The engineer must determine whether the failure is in the Arc control channel or in the extension provisioning process before retrying. Which two actions should the engineer take? Option A. Delete and recreate the Azure Arc machine resource so that a new resource identity is issued. Option B. Run AZ-CM agent show and verify that the connected machine agent is connected and its dependent services are running. Option C. Remove and reinstall the extension repeatedly until the portal reports succeeded. Option D. Review C program data guestconfig ext_mech.log gc_exp.log and the extension-specific logs for the failed provisioning interval. Option E. Reinstall the Azure Connected Machine agent without first checking its connection or service state. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and D. Option B. Run AZ-CM agent show and verify that the connected machine agent is connected and its dependent services are running. Option D. Review C program data guestconfig ext selectively gc myio_lasty.log and the extension-specific logs for the failed provisioning interval. These actions test two orthogonal layers. AZ-CM agent show validates the Arc control channel and dependent services after the proxy change. The guestconfig extension manager and extension-specific logs expose download, verification, handler, and provisioning failures inside the extension layer. Together, they localize the fault before any retry or replacement changes state. For an Arc extension failure, split diagnosis into control channel health, AZ-CM agent show, and guest extension execution, guestconfig logs. Question 15 of 50. After a firmware maintenance window, a Windows server starts at the BitLocker recovery screen. The recovery password is available, but the team wants to determine whether the TPM state or protector configuration caused recovery before changing protectors or decrypting the volume. Which evidence set should the engineer collect after regaining access? Option A. The BitLocker API logs, TPM-related system events, get TPM output, manage BDE-status, and manage BDE-protectors-get output. Option B. Only the system log entries from the most recent startup. Option C. A GP result report and a list of installed Windows updates only. Option D. A full memory dump captured after suspending BitLocker protection. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. The BitLocker API logs, TPM-related system events, get TPM output, manage BDE-status, and manage BDE-protectors-get output. The supported BitLocker workflow correlates BitLocker API events and TPM-related system events with current TPM, volume, and key protector state. This evidence distinguishes a TPM/firmware measurement change from a policy or protector problem before the engineer modifies protection. The recovery password should be used to regain access, not treated as proof that decryption or protector replacement is required. A recovery prompt after firmware work requires correlation of BitLocker events, TPM evidence, volume status, and protector inventory before changing encryption state. Question 16 of 50. A 4-node storage spaces direct cluster has lower write throughput after 2 capacity drives were replaced. All virtual disks remain healthy, and no physical disk is reported failed. The engineer suspects that the replacement media changed the pool's drive or cache composition. Which action best tests that hypothesis before replacing more hardware? Option A. Run repair virtual disk against every virtual disk, even though each virtual disk reports healthy. Option B. Run get physical disk and get storage reliability counter for the pool drives, and compare media type, usage, health, and reliability data with the cluster's known good inventory and performance baseline. Option C. Change every virtual disk to a different resiliency setting and measure throughput again. Option D. Evict the node that owns the cluster group and repeat the workload on the remaining nodes. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Run get physical disk and get storage reliability counter for the pool drives and compare media type, usage, health, and reliability data with the cluster's known good inventory and performance baseline. The reported health state does not prove that replacement drives match the intended media and cache composition. Inventorying the physical disks and their reliability counters, then comparing those facts with a known good configuration and baseline directly tests for a media role, health, or latency mismatch without altering pool or resiliency state. Healthy virtual disks plus a regression immediately after drive replacement points first to physical media inventory and reliability evidence, not a blind repair or resiliency redesign. Question 17 of 50. An administrator accidentally deletes a user account from Active Directory. Active Directory Recycle Bin was enabled in the forest 6 months ago, and the deletion occurred today. The account must be returned to its original location with its preserved attributes and group memberships. What should the administrator do? Option A. Create a new user with the same sign-in name and manually add the known group memberships. Option B. Boot a domain controller into Directory Services Restore mode and perform an authoritative system state restore. Option C. Restore the user from the deleted objects container in Active Directory Administrative Center. Option D. Enable Active Directory Recycle Bin again and wait for the deleted object to appear. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Restore the user from the deleted objects container in Active Directory Administrative Center. Because Recycle Bin was enabled before the deletion, ADAC can restore the deleted object to its original location while preserving its link-valued and non-link-valued attributes, including group memberships. This is an object-level recovery and does not require taking a domain controller offline. Recycle Bin enabled before deletion means use deleted objects for an identity-preserving object restore, not account recreation or DC recovery. Question 18 of 50. A domain controller's ADDS database is damaged, and the server cannot start directory services normally. A verified system state backup from before the damage is available. The engineer must restore the database while preventing ADDS from opening the database or servicing authentication during the restore. Which startup mode should the engineer use? Option A. Safe mode with networking, so the domain controller can contact a replication partner during the restore. Option B. Normal startup with the Active Directory Domain Services service paused. Option C. Windows recovery environment, followed by an offline copy of ntds.dit from the backup media. Option D. Directory Services Restore mode, authenticating with a DSRM administrator credential. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D, Directory Services Restore mode, authenticating with the DSRM administrator credential. Directory Services Restore mode starts the domain controller with ADDS offline, so supported system state recovery can operate on the directory database. DSRM uses its separate administrator credential because normal domain authentication is unavailable while directory services are offline. The requirement that ADDs remain offline while a system state backup restores the directory database identifies DSRM and its separate credential. Question 19 of 50. A domain uses DFS replication for sysvol. DC3 has a corrupted local sysvol copy, but DC1 and DC2 have current consistent policy content and replicate successfully with each other. The engineer must rebuild only DC3's sysvol from a healthy partner without making DC3's damaged copy authoritative. Which recovery approach should be used? Option A. Perform a non-authoritative DFSR sysvol synchronization on DC3 so it rebuilds its local content from a healthy partner. Option B. Perform an authoritative DFSR sysvol synchronization on DC3 by setting MS DFSR-options to 1. Option C. copy the sysvol folder manually from DC1 to DC3 while DFS replication remains active. Option D. Apply the FRS burflags D4 procedure to DC1 and DC2, then force replication to DC3. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Perform a non-authoritative DFSR sysvol synchronization on DC3, so it rebuilds its local content from a healthy partner. Only one replica is damaged, and healthy authoritative content already exists elsewhere. So DC3 should undergo a non-authoritative DFSR sysvol synchronization. DC3 then treats its local copy as disposable and receives policy content from a healthy replication partner. No domain-wide authoritative designation is needed. One bad DFSR sysvol replica plus healthy partners means non-authoritative recovery on only the bad DC. Authoritative recovery is for choosing the source copy. Question 20 of 50. After a firewall change between two Active Directory sites, repadmin/show-repl on a spoke site domain controller reports the RPC server is unavailable for its hub partner. DNS resolves the partner correctly, and Kerberos authentication to the partner succeeds. The firewall team confirms that TCP 135 is allowed, but the dynamic RPC range is blocked. What should the engineer request? Option A. Create a new site link with a shorter replication interval so the failed requests retry more often. Option B. Allow the required Active Directory replication dynamic RPC traffic between the domain controllers. Or configure and allow a documented fixed replication RPC port. Option C. Run repadmin syncall repeatedly to force replication through TCP 135. Option D. Disable strict replication consistency on the spoke domain controller, so it accepts the hub's changes. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Allow the required Active Directory replication dynamic RPC traffic between the domain controllers. Or configure and allow a documented fixed replication RPC port. TCP 135 reaches the RPC endpoint mapper, but Active Directory replication RPC uses a dynamically assigned port by default, unless replication is explicitly restricted to a fixed port. With DNS and authentication already working, and the dynamic range confirmed blocked, the firewall path is the isolated cause. The engineer must allow that traffic or use the documented fixed port design and permit it end-to-end. Port 135 only locates an RPC endpoint. If the dynamic RPC range is blocked, replication still fails after successful DNS and authentication. Question 21 of 50. A domain join attempt from a branch office Windows server fails with error 1355, indicating that the domain cannot be contacted. The server can reach the internet through the branch proxy, but its network adapter lists a public DNS resolver. Other clients that use the branch domain controller for DNS can join the domain. Which two actions should the engineer take first? Option A. Add the branch proxy address as the server's preferred DNS server, so domain discovery follows the internet route. Option B. Create an intra-connect synchronization rule for the server account before retrying the on-premises domain join. Option C. Configure the server to use the AD integrated DNS server and verify that the domain's DC locator SRV records resolve. Option D. Point the server directly to the domain controller's host address in the host file and leave the public DNS resolver configured. Option E. Run nltest/dsgetdc: from the server to verify domain controller discovery after correcting DNS. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are C and E. Option C. Configure the server to use the AD integrated DNS server and verify that the domain's DC locator SRV records resolve. Option E. Run nltest/ AZ-802/DSGETDC: from the server to verify domain controller discovery after correcting DNS. An ADDS domain join depends on DNS-based DC locator records, not on internet or proxy reachability. The server must query DNS that hosts the AD integrated zone, and inltest dsgetDC verifies the separate DC discovery mechanism after DNS is corrected. These actions are orthogonal. One repairs name service configuration, the other validates domain controller location. Internet access does not prove AD reachability. Error 1355 plus a public DNS resolver points first to AD DNS SRV resolution, then DC locator validation. Question 22 of 50. A user who belongs to hundreds of nested groups can sign in, but an integrated Windows application returns HTTP 400 when the user authenticates. Users with fewer group memberships can access the same application. DNS, time synchronization, and the application's SPN are correct. Which investigation best tests the suspected Kerberos authorization data problem? Option A. Use setSPN-X to search for duplicate SPNs and re-register the application's SPN on its service account. Option B. Purge the user's Kerberos tickets and force NTLM for the application as the permanent remediation. Option C. Compare the affected user's group-derived token size and Kerberos ticket data with an unaffected user's data, and review Kerberos and HTTP logs for an oversized request. Option D. Increase the Kerberos maximum clock skew because additional group SIDs take longer for the KDC to process. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Compare the affected user's group-derived token size and Kerberos ticket data with an unaffected user's data, and review Kerberos and HTTP logs for an oversized request. Kerberos tickets carry authorization data derived from group membership. A failure limited to a heavily nested user, with DNS, time, and SPNs already validated, warrants comparing ticket and group-derived token size and checking the relevant Kerberos and HTTP evidence. That establishes whether request or token size is the boundary before any registry or group membership change. When only highly nested users fail and SPN, DNS, and time checks pass, inspect group-derived token and ticket size before changing authentication protocols. Question 23 of 50. A domain-joined laptop was restored from an old offline image. A local administrator can sign in, but domain sign-in reports that the trust relationship failed. The system log contains net logon event 3210, and nltest/sc queries returns error async dillisecond. DNS resolves a writable domain controller correctly. What should the engineer do next while preserving the domain join? Option A. Delete the computer object in Active Directory, users, and computers, and then recreate it with the same name. Option B. Reset the affected user's domain password and purge the user's Kerberos ticket cache. Option C. Disable automatic computer account password changes on the laptop and wait for Active Directory replication. Option D. Reset the secure channel computer password against a reachable domain controller by using reset computer machine password with domain credentials. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Reset the secure channel computer password against a reachable domain controller by using reset computer machine password with domain credentials. Restoring an old image can leave the local machine account secret older than the password stored in ADDS. Netlogon event 3210 and a failed secure channel query support that boundary. Reset computer machine password synchronizes the computer password with a domain controller without first removing and rejoining the computer. Netlogon 3210 after restoring an old image indicates a machine account secret mismatch. Repair the secure channel before considering a domain rejoin. Question 24 of 50. An Azure VM intermittently takes 20 seconds to read application data. During an incident, Task Manager shows both elevated network activity and disk activity, so the engineer cannot tell which subsystem is delaying requests. The next occurrence might be overnight. Which collection design provides the most useful evidence? Option A. Log physical disk latency and queue counters together with network interface throughput counters at the same interval through the expected incident window. Option B. Capture a one-time resource monitor screenshot while the VM is currently responsive. Option C. Collect only logical disk percentage free space because low free space uniquely identifies storage latency. Option D. Enable an Azure Platform metric alert for VM availability and infer the bottleneck from whether the VM remains online. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Log physical disk latency and queue counters together with network interface throughput counters at the same interval through the expected incident window. A time-aligned performance monitor log permits direct correlation of disk latency and queue behavior with network throughput during the intermittent slowdown. A snapshot cannot capture an overnight recurrence. Free space data does not establish latency, and availability does not distinguish guest disk from network contention. For an intermittent bottleneck with two credible subsystems, collect their counters on one timeline rather than relying on a live snapshot. Question 25 of 50. A file server must record SMB, memory, and disk counters from 0800 through 1800 each weekday for later capacity analysis. No one will be signed in when collection starts. Which performance monitor configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Open the performance monitor graph, add the counters, and leave the console minimized. Option B. Create a user-defined data collector set with the required counters, a writable output path, and a weekday start and stop schedule. Option C. Create a System Insights CPU forecast and export its latest prediction each evening. Option D. Create an Azure Monitor data collection rule without associating it with the file server. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Create a user-defined data collector set with the required counters, a writable output path, and a weekday start and stop schedule. A user-defined data collector set records selected counters to a performance log and can be scheduled to start and stop without an interactive console session. Its run identity and output path must permit writing the log. The resulting history supports later capacity analysis. Selected counters plus an unattended recurring window and later analysis signals a scheduled user-defined data collector set. Question 26 of 50. Operations manages an on-premises storage spaces direct cluster through Windows Admin Center. They want cluster telemetry available in Azure and an email when a capacity query crosses its threshold. The cluster is not yet connected to an Azure monitoring workspace. Which action should the engineer take? Option A. Create a local performance monitor alert data collector set and enter the team's SMTP server in Windows Admin Center. Option B. Enable System Insights on one cluster node and assume its local prediction automatically emails the operations team. Option C. Register Windows Admin Center with Azure. Onboard the cluster servers to Azure Monitor and a log analytics workspace, and then configure the query-based email alert in Azure Monitor. Option D. Install the Windows Admin Center gateway on every cluster node, so local dashboard notifications are converted to Azure alerts. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Register Windows Admin Center with Azure. Onboard the cluster servers to Azure Monitor and a log analytics workspace, and then configure the query-based email alert in Azure Monitor. Windows Admin Center can onboard on-premises servers to Azure Monitor and a log analytics workspace. Once telemetry is collected there, Azure Monitor supplies the query-based alert and notification path. Windows Admin Center's local dashboard is not itself an SMTP alerting service, and local System Insights predictions do not automatically create Azure notifications. Windows Admin Center plus on-premises telemetry, a log analytics query, and email requires Azure onboarding first and Azure Monitor alerting second. Question 27 of 50. A disconnected Windows Server 2022 Hyper-V host needs local forecasts of CPU demand and volume consumption, so administrators can plan capacity before exhaustion. Security policy prohibits sending performance data to a cloud service. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use Performance Monitor's live graph because current counter values predict the host future capacity trend. Option B. Onboard the host to VM Insights and disable log analytics ingestion after the first prediction is generated. Option C. Create Azure Monitor dynamic threshold alerts without installing an agent or permitting cloud connectivity. Option D. Use System Insights capacity forecasting capabilities and manage the predictions locally through Windows Admin Center or PowerShell. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Use System Insights capacity forecasting capabilities and manage the predictions locally through Windows Admin Center or PowerShell. System Insights analyzes data locally on Windows Server 2019 and newer, and includes CPU and storage consumption forecasting capabilities. It can be managed through Windows Admin Center or PowerShell without cloud connectivity. The requirement is predictive analysis, not a live counter display or a cloud alert. Predictive CPU and storage capacity on a disconnected Windows server points to System Insights because its collection and analysis remain local. Question 28 of 50. A support engineer must investigate application crashes from the last 48 hours. The ticket requires a reusable event viewer view limited to the application's provider and error level, plus a native .evtx file that preserves the matching events for offline review. Which two actions should the engineer take? Option A. Create a custom view over the application log filtered by the 48-hour interval, the application's provider, and error level. Option B. Clear the application log after applying a current log filter, so the remaining display contains only new crashes. Option C. Archive the entire unfiltered application log and rely on the support team to identify the provider and time range. Option D. Export the events represented by that custom view to an .evtx file and attach the file to the ticket. Option E. Create a Windows Event Forwarding subscription that begins collecting future events from every server in the domain. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and D. Option A. Create a custom view over the application log filtered by the 48-hour interval, the application's provider, and error level. Option D. Export the events represented by that custom view to an .evtx file and attach the file to the ticket. The custom view satisfies the reusable event viewer filtering requirement, while exporting the view to .evtx creates the separate native artifact for offline review. These are orthogonal actions. One defines a saved query, and the other preserves and transfers its matching event records. When a scenario asks for both a reusable GUI filter and a portable native evidence file, create a custom view and then export its events to .evtx. Question 29 of 50. A team deploys Azure Monitor Agent to Windows VMs by infrastructure as code. Only selected IIS and application events should reach log analytics, and records from test sites must be dropped before storage to reduce ingestion cost. New scale set instances must receive the same configuration automatically. Which design meets the requirement? Option A. Define the required event data sources, an ingestion transformation that filters test records, and the log analytics destination in a version-controlled DCR. Create DCR associations for the target resources as part of deployment. Option B. Configure diagnostic settings on the log analytics workspace and use a workbook query to hide test records after ingestion. Option C. Install the legacy log analytics agent and place the DCR in the same resource group as the scale set without creating associations. Option D. Collect every event with Azure Monitor Agent and add an alert processing rule that suppresses notifications from test sites. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Define the required event data sources, an ingestion transformation that filters test records, and the log analytics destination in a version-controlled DCR. Create DCR associations for the target resources as part of deployment. A DCR defines the data sources, transformation, and destination. Its transformation can filter records before storage, and a DCR association connects the rule to each monitored resource. Managing both rule and associations as code gives new instances the intended repeatable collection path without ingesting excluded records. For AMA, remember the three-part boundary. The DCR defines collection and transformation, the destination stores it, and the DCRA targets resources. Question 30 of 50. Application events from Windows servers are already stored in a log analytics workspace. Operations wants Azure Monitor to evaluate a KQL query every 5 minutes. Open an alert when more than 50 matching errors occur in a 15-minute window, and invoke an HTTPS remediation endpoint. Which configuration should the engineer create? Option A, a metric alert on the workspace's ingestion volume metric with the remediation URL entered as the alert description. Option B, a scheduled query alert using the KQL result and threshold linked to an action group with a webhook receiver. Option C, an activity log alert for write operations on the log analytics workspace linked to an email-only action group. Option D, an alert processing rule that runs the KQL query and posts every matching log record directly to the endpoint. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B, a scheduled query alert using the KQL result and threshold, linked to an action group with a webhook receiver. A scheduled query alert evaluates log analytics data with KQL over the configured window and frequency. The threshold determines when the alert fires, while an action group supplies the webhook receiver that invokes the remediation endpoint. The query rule and notification/action path are separate Azure Monitor components. KQL plus a time window and threshold selects a scheduled query alert. An external HTTPS action belongs in an action group webhook receiver. Question 31 of 50. Operations wants to compare guest memory and disk performance across 6 Azure Arc-enabled Windows servers in one Azure Monitor view. The servers appear as Arc resources, but the VM Insights Get Started page lists them as not monitored. Host availability data alone is insufficient. What should the engineer do? Option A, create an Azure Monitor workbook that queries each server's Azure activity log without changing data collection. Option B, enable only Azure platform metrics on each Arc resource because those metrics include Windows guest memory counters automatically. Option C, enable VM Insights data collection for the Arc-enabled servers, including Azure Monitor Agent and the applicable data collection rule, and then use the multi-machine performance view. Option D, install the legacy diagnostics extension and use its local performance log as the VM Insights workspace source. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Enable VM Insights data collection for the Arc-enabled servers, including Azure Monitor Agent and the applicable data collection rule, and then use the multi-machine performance view. VM Insights supports Azure Arc-enabled servers and provides multi-machine performance analysis, but the machines must first be configured for monitoring. Azure Monitor Agent and the applicable data collection rule provide guest performance data. VM Insights then exposes that data through its performance view. Activity logs and host-level metrics do not supply the required guest counters. Arc registration makes a server an Azure resource. It does not by itself make guest performance data available to VM Insights. Question 32 of 50. An Azure Arc-enabled Windows server became disconnected immediately after a proxy policy change. DNS resolves the Arc endpoint. The network adapter has a valid gateway, and other servers on the subnet remain connected through the same perimeter firewall. A packet capture from the affected server shows TCP SYN retransmissions to the proxy address with no SYN ACK. Which next step best isolates the failing boundary? Option A. Reset the connected machine agent identity and re-onboard the server before testing the network path. Option B. Disable Windows Defender Firewall on the server and assume any continuing failure is caused by the Azure service. Option C. Change the subnet's Azure Network Security Group because it governs outbound traffic from every Arc-enabled on-premises server. Option D. Test TCP reachability from the server to the configured proxy port and compare the effective host and proxy firewall rules with a working server. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Test TCP reachability from the server to the configured proxy port, and compare the effective host and proxy firewall rules with a working server. The unanswered SYN packets place the failure before any TLS or Arc agent exchange. Testing the exact proxy address and port, then comparing host and proxy policy with a working peer, isolates the TCP and firewall boundary without destroying the agent configuration. An Azure NSG does not govern an ordinary on-premises subnet. Repeated SYNs with no SYN ACK identify a transport path failure before application authentication. Test the exact destination port and each firewall boundary. Question 33 of 50. Clients can resolve names in the internal AD/DS zone, but every public internet lookup sent to the same Windows DNS server returns a server failure. The server has no DNS forwarders configured, and its root hints tab is empty after the cache.dns file was replaced. What should the administrator do? Option A. Restore valid root hints in the DNS server configuration, such as by copying them from a known good DNS server, and retest an internet query. Option B. Run ipconfig/flush DNS on every client and leave the DNS server configuration unchanged. Option C. Replace the internal AD integrated zone with a secondary zone hosted by a public DNS provider. Option D. Disable recursion on the DNS server, so unresolved public queries bypass the missing root hints. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Restore valid root hints in the DNS server configuration, such as by copying them from a known good DNS server, and retest an internet query. With internal resolution working, no forwarders, and no root hints, the DNS server lacks a path for recursive internet resolution. Restoring valid root hints gives it that path. A client cache flush cannot repair missing server configuration, and disabling recursion prevents the required lookup behavior. Internal names succeed while internet names fail, with no forwarder and empty root hints. Repair the server's recursion path, not client caches. Question 34 of 50. A Windows server receives its approved cumulative update from WSUS, downloads the package, and begins installation. Installation repeatedly fails with 0x800F081F. Windows Update Client/Operational confirms the same failure code. No restart is pending, and another server using the same WSUS policy installs the update. What should the engineer do next? Option A. Change the server to scan Microsoft Update directly, because successful download does not test WSUS reachability. Option B. Run DISM to assess and repair the Windows component store, supplying an appropriate repair source if required, and then retry the update. Option C. Delete the server's WSUS computer object and wait for it to be recreated before collecting servicing evidence. Option D. Reset the TCP/IP stack, because every installation stage failure indicates a network transport problem. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Run DISM to assess and repair the Windows component store, supplying an appropriate repair source if required, and then retry the update. The package reaches the server and fails during servicing, while a peer under the same WSUS policy succeeds. That evidence shifts the boundary from WSUS delivery to the local servicing/category store. Microsoft guidance directs administrators to use DISM, or the System Update Readiness approach, for this class of update failure, with a valid repair source when necessary. Separate update delivery from update servicing. Successful download plus an installation stage 0x800F error points to local component store repair. Question 35 of 50. A standalone Windows server stopped synchronizing after its network was moved behind a new firewall. The server must use time.contoso.net as a manual NTP peer. The name resolves, but W32TM/query/status reports local CMOS clock, and W32TM/resync returns no time data was available. Which two actions should the engineer take? Option A. Join the server to an ADDS domain so the NT5DS hierarchy replaces the required manual peer. Option B. Use W32TM/stripchart against time.contoso.net to test whether NTP responses reach the server through the new network path. Option C. Increase the Kerberos maximum clock skew on the standalone server before testing NTP connectivity. Option D. Set the Windows Time Service startup type to disabled so the hardware clock can query the NTP peer directly. Option E. Configure time.contoso.net as a manual peer with the NTP client flag. Update the Windows Time Service configuration, and then rediscover and resynchronize. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and E. Option B. Use W32TM/stripchart against time.contoso.net to test whether NTP responses reach the server through the new network path. Option E. Configure time.contoso.net as a manual peer with the NTP client flag. Update the Windows Time Service configuration, and then rediscover and resynchronize. The engineer must validate two independent mechanisms, whether NTP traffic traverses the change network and whether W32time is configured to use the required manual source. W32TM/stripchart tests responses from the peer, configuring the manual peer in client mode and rediscovering applies the intended source. One action tests reachability, while the other corrects client configuration. Local CMOS clock plus no time data after a network move requires both NTP path validation and explicit manual peer client configuration. Question 36 of 50. A Hyper-V host has intermittent 30-second pauses. During a pause, logical disk average disk sec/read remains above 0.080 seconds. Network interface bytes total per second stays below 10% of link capacity. CPU is mostly idle, and one backup process shows a sharp increase in I/O read operations per second. What conclusion and next action are best supported? Option A. The network is saturated. Replace the network adapter because any file transfer workload is network bound. Option B. Memory pressure is proven. Disable the page file because disk latency and paging are equivalent signals. Option C. Storage latency is the supported bottleneck, correlated with the backup process. Investigate that process's I/O path and the storage subsystem before changing hardware. Option D. CPU contention is the primary bottleneck. Assign the backup process to fewer processors to reduce disk latency. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Storage latency is the supported bottleneck, correlated with the backup process. Investigate that process's I/O path and the storage subsystem before changing hardware. Sustained read latency above 80 milliseconds is a storage signal, while low network utilization and idle CPU argue against those resources as the primary constraint. The process-level I/O spike correlates the incident with the backup workload. The evidence supports investigating the workload and storage path before selecting a hardware or configuration remediation. Correlate resource counters with process counters in the same interval. High disk latency plus process I/O with low CPU and network use isolates storage. Question 37 of 50. A custom script extension on an Azure Arc enabled Windows server changes to failed after a proxy policy update. The portal shows only a generic provisioning error. AZ-CM agent show reports connected and all dependent services as running. Where should the engineer investigate next before reinstalling the extension? Option A. Reset the server's ADDS computer account because Arc extension handlers authenticate through the domain secure channel. Option B. Delete the Azure Arc resource and reinstall the connected machine agent, even though agent health is confirmed. Option C. Review only C Windows Update.log because all extension packages are installed exclusively by Windows Update. Option D. Review C program data guest config ext greg _lab gc _str.log and the extension-specific files under C program data guest config for package download or handler errors. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Review C program data guest config ext disclosing gc.exp.log and the extension-specific files under C program data guest config for package download or handler errors. After confirming that the connected machine agent and its services are healthy, Microsoft directs extension troubleshooting to the guest config extension manager and extension-specific logs. gc_ext.log records package download and verification errors, which is especially relevant after a proxy change. Rebuilding the Arc identity before reading that evidence is premature. When AZ-CM agent is connected, but one extension fails, move down one layer to guest config extension manager and handler logs before re-onboarding. Question 38 of 50. BitLocker activation fails on a Windows server with a generic prerequisite error. Manage-BDE-status shows that encryption has not started. The engineer needs to determine whether TPM state, Windows recovery environment, the system partition, or applied policy is blocking activation. Which evidence package should be collected first? Option A. Get TPM, manage BDE-status and protector output, reagent C/info, GP result, and BitLocker API plus TPM related event logs. Option B. Only the Azure activity log and the virtual network flow log, because BitLocker prerequisite failures are evaluated by the Azure control plane. Option C. A memory dump and a storage throughput benchmark, without collecting BitLocker status or policy results. Option D. Only the recovery password, followed immediately by deleting and recreating every key protector. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Get TPM, manage BDE-status and protector output, reagent C/info, GP result, and BitLocker API plus TPM related event logs. Microsoft's BitLocker troubleshooting guidance calls for status from the TPM, BitLocker volumes and protectors, Windows RE, resultant policy, and the BitLocker and TPM event logs. Together, these sources distinguish prerequisite and policy boundaries before any protector changes. A generic activation failure does not justify destructive key operations. A generic BitLocker activation failure calls for a state and policy evidence bundle, TPM, volume protectors, Windows RE, FVE policy, and BitLocker events. Question 39 of 50. A 4-node storage spaces direct cluster develops high write latency after one capacity drive begins reporting media errors. All nodes and cluster networks remain online. The engineer must confirm the affected storage component and any active repair work before replacing hardware. Which action is most appropriate? Option A. Run chickdisk/f simultaneously on every CSV, because file system repair identifies physical drive media errors and pool repair state. Option B. Use get physical disk and storage reliability counters. Then inspect the storage pool and current storage health, or repair actions. Option C. Remove the cluster's virtual disks and recreate the pool so the drive with media errors is automatically excluded. Option D. Increase the SMB client timeout, because all storage spaces direct latency originates in the file access protocol layer. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. use get physical disk and storage reliability counters, then inspect the storage pool and current storage health or repair actions. Storage Spaces Direct aggregates physical disks into a pool and can run repair activity after faults. Physical disk state and reliability counters identify the device reporting errors, while pool and health action evidence shows the logical impact and repair progress. This evidence should be collected before a drive replacement or destructive pool operation. In Storage Spaces Direct, separate physical media health from pooled virtual disk health. Inspect both before replacing a drive. Question 40 of 50. An administrator accidentally deletes an OU containing a universal group and user accounts in a multi-domain forest. Active Directory Recycle Bin was enabled before the deletion. Administrators need the objects returned to their pre-deletion logical state, including the group's cross-domain linked memberships. What should the recovery engineer do? Option A. Recreate the OU, group, and users with the same names and rely on replication to restore their original object identities and links. Option B. Boot a writable domain controller into DSRM and perform an authoritative system state restore because linked values cannot be retained by AD Recycle Bin. Option C. Restore the deleted objects from the deleted objects container by using ADAC or restore AD object. Preserve their hierarchy or target path, and verify the restored links after replication. Option D. Restore the objects on an RODC by writing them directly into its local directory database, then force outbound replication to writable domain controllers. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Restore the deleted objects from the deleted objects container by using ADAC or restore AD object. Preserve their hierarchy or target path, and verify the restored links after replication. Because Recycle Bin was enabled before deletion, deleted objects retain link-valued and non-link-valued attributes and can be restored through ADAC or restore AD object to a consistent pre-deletion logical state. The engineer should preserve the container hierarchy or use an explicit target path and verify replication and links. Recreating names does not recreate object identities, and an RODC cannot originate these directory writes. Recycle Bin enabled before deletion means object-level restoration can preserve linked and non-linked attributes. Do not escalate to database recovery or name-only recreation. Question 41 of 50. A domain controller must be started in Directory Services Restore Mode, DSRM, to restore ADDS from a system state backup. Before the maintenance window, the engineer discovers that the documented DSRM password is unknown. The domain controller is currently online, and ADDS is functioning. What should the engineer do before restarting it? Option A. Reset the domain administrator account password and use that password automatically in DSRM. Option B. Delete the domain controller's computer account and allow the next restart to create a DSRM credential. Option C. Start a non-authoritative sysvol synchronization so DFSR stores the current domain credentials locally. Option D. Use ntdsutil to set a known DSRM administrator password while the domain controller is online and validate the recovery plan before the restart. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Use ntdsutil to set a known DSRM administrator password while the domain controller is online, and validate the recovery plan before the restart. DSRM uses its own local administrator credential rather than automatically using the domain administrator password. Microsoft documents using ntdsutil's DSRM password reset function while the domain controller is running. Establishing that credential before taking the server offline prevents an avoidable recovery lockout. The system state restore can then proceed in DSRM under the selected authoritative or non-authoritative recovery plan. When a domain controller must boot offline for recovery, verify the separate DSRM credential before the outage. Ordinary domain credentials are not a substitute. Question 42 of 50. A bad administrative change corrupted the same DFSR replicated sysvol policy on every domain controller. DC1 has been restored to a verified system state backup that contains the required policy. DC2 and DC3 remain isolated until a valid sysvol source is available. Which two actions establish and verify the authoritative sysvol source on DC1? Option A. Mark DC1's sysvol subscription as authoritative by setting MS-DFSR-options to 1. Then restart the DFSR service as directed by the recovery procedure. Option B. Set the FRS BUR flag's D4 value on DC1, even though the domain uses DFSR for sysvol. Option C. Verify DFS replication event 4602 on DC1 before allowing the other domain controllers to synchronize non-authoritatively from the recovered data. Option D. Mark the sysvol subscription authoritative on DC1, DC2, and DC3 so each domain controller can publish its local copy. Option E. Copy the restored policies folder directly into the live sysvol paths on DC2 and DC3 before DFSR is started on DC1. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and C. Option A. Mark DC1's sysvol subscription as authoritative by setting MS-DFSR-options to 1. Then restart the DFSR service as directed by the recovery procedure. Option C. Verify DFS replication event 4602 on DC1 before allowing the other domain controllers to synchronize non-authoritatively from the recovered data. For an authoritative synchronization of DFSR replicated sysvol, one recovered domain controller is designated as the authoritative source by setting MS-DFSR options to 1 on its sysvol subscription and restarting DFSR according to the documented procedure. DFS replication event 4602 confirms that authoritative initialization occurred. Only after that verification should the remaining domain controllers perform non-authoritative synchronization. The two actions are orthogonal. One establishes the source, and the other verifies it. For DFSR sysvol, establish exactly one authoritative subscription and look for event 4602 before releasing non-authoritative partners. Question 43 of 50. A failed domain controller promotion left a stale server object in a child domain. An RODC in that domain now reports replication failures, but replication between the writable domain controllers is healthy. The engineer must determine the failing naming context and inbound source before changing topology metadata. Which command provides the most relevant first evidence? Option A, repadmin/showRepl on the affected RODC to display inbound neighbors, naming contexts, last attempts, and error codes. Option B, repadmin/syncall on the RODC, followed immediately by metadata deletion if any error remains. Option C, dcdiag/test:/DNS on only the forest root PDC emulator. Option D, repadmin/ccc on every domain controller to recalculate all connection objects before collecting current status. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A, repadmin/showRepl on the affected RODC to display inbound neighbors, naming contexts, last attempts, and error codes. repadmin/showRepl reports the affected domain controller's inbound replication partners and status by directory partition, including last success information and failure codes. That evidence identifies whether the RODC is trying to pull a naming context from the stale source before the engineer forces replication, recalculates topology, or performs metadata cleanup. Replication is pull-based. When one domain controller fails, inspect that destination's inbound neighbors and per partition status before forcing synchronization. Question 44 of 50. A branch has an RODC and an intermittent WAN link. Members of the branch users group can sign in while the WAN is available, but after the link fails, only previously cached users can sign in. The RODC's password replication policy denies the branch users group, and no affected account appears in the RODC's revealed list. The security team permits those users' passwords to be cached at this branch. What should the engineer change? Option A. Add branch users to the RODC's allowed password replication policy while leaving the group in the denied policy, then wait for the next offline sign-in. Option B. Remove branch users from the effective denied policy, add it to the RODC's allowed password replication policy, and pre-populate the permitted account passwords before the next WAN outage. Option C. Grant branch users permission to write the RODC's computer object so the users can update their cached passwords locally. Option D. Convert the RODC to a writable domain controller, so every domain password is replicated to the branch automatically. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Remove branch users from the effective denied policy, add it to the RODC's allowed password replication policy, and pre-populate the permitted account passwords before the next WAN outage. An RODC can authenticate a user during WAN loss only when it has a usable cache credential for that account. A denied password replication policy takes precedence over an allowed entry, so the group must be removed from the effective deny path and permitted by the RODC's allowed policy. Pre-populating the now permitted passwords makes them available before the next outage, rather than waiting for successful online authentications to populate the cache. RODC authentication that works online but fails during WAN loss points to credential caching. Check effective deny, allowed policy, and pre-population in that order. Question 45 of 50. An internet application uses Windows authentication on IIS and connects to SQL Server by using each caller's identity. Direct Windows authenticated connections to SQL succeed, and users receive a Kerberos ticket for the IIS HTTP service. Requests through IIS fail at SQL with an anonymous logon error. Which configuration addresses this double hop failure without allowing delegation to unrelated services? Option A. Enable unconstrained delegation on the IIS server computer account so it can forward credentials to any service. Option B. Register the HTTP SPN on the SQL Server service account and configure delegation from SQL back to IIS. Option C. Verify that the HTTP and SQL Service SPNs are uniquely registered to their actual service identities. Then configure constrained delegation from the IIS service identity to the required SQL Service SPN. Option D. Increase max token size on IIS because every Kerberos double hop failure is caused by excessive group membership. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Verify that the HTTP and SQL Service SPNs are uniquely registered to their actual service identities. Then configure constrained delegation from the IIS service identity to the required SQL Service SPN. The first hop already obtains an HTTP service ticket, while the failure occurs when IIS tries to access SQL as the user. The service identities need correct, unique SPNs, and the IIS identity must be permitted to delegate specifically to the SQL service. Constrained delegation provides that second hop path without granting the broad reach of unconstrained delegation. If the client gets the front-end service ticket, but the back-end sees anonymous logon, validate both SPNs and delegate from the front-end identity only to the back-end service. Question 46 of 50. A production member server was created by copying a domain-joined VM without generalizing the image. The original VM and the copy now use the same computer name. The copy logs netlogon event 3210 and reports a broken trust relationship. DNS reaches a writable domain controller. What should the engineer do before returning the copy to service? Option A. Reset the affected user's domain password and purge that user's Kerberos tickets on both VMs. Option B. Disable computer account password changes on both VMs so their current machine secrets remain identical. Option C. Run reset computer machine password on both simultaneously while they retain the duplicate name. Option D. Isolate the copy, assign it a unique generalized identity and computer account, and then establish and test its secure channel with the domain. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Isolate the copy, assign it a unique generalized identity and computer account, and then establish and test its secure channel with the domain. Two active machines cannot safely share one computer identity and machine account secret. The clone must first be isolated and given a unique, properly generalized identity and corresponding computer account. The engineer can then establish and validate that machine's secure channel. Resetting a channel while duplicate identities remain would let the two machines continue overwriting or invalidating the same relationship. A cloned, domain-joined VM with a duplicate name is an identity collision first and a channel repair second. Make the identity unique before resetting trust. Question 47 of 50. Azure Monitor shows that an Arc-enabled file server had a 10-minute CPU spike at 02:15. The server recovered without intervention. A local performance monitor data collector set and Windows event logs cover the same period. Before changing services or collection settings, what should the engineer do? Option A. Align the Azure timestamp with the local counter log and relevant event records to identify the process or event that coincided with the spike. Option B. Increase the DCR sampling rate immediately and use the next incident as the only evidence. Option C. Restart the highest CPU service currently visible in Task Manager, even though the spike has ended. Option D. Treat the Azure CPU chart as proof that the server requires more virtual processors. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Align the Azure timestamp with the local counter log and relevant event records to identify the process or event that coincided with the spike. The existing local counter history and event records preserve evidence from the exact Azure Monitor interval. Correlating those sources can distinguish a process workload, scheduled activity, or operating system event before remediation changes the environment. A platform-level CPU spike alone does not identify the responsible process or prove that capacity is insufficient. When cloud and local evidence cover the same transient incident, correlate their timestamps before changing workload or telemetry configuration. Question 48 of 50. A company monitors Azure VMs and Arc-enabled Windows servers. It needs centrally defined guest performance collection, a curated VM performance experience, and an HTTPS call to its incident platform when a query threshold is exceeded. Which design assigns each Azure Monitor component to its correct responsibility? Option A. Use VM Insights to install arbitrary collection scripts, an action group to select counters, and AMA to evaluate the alert threshold. Option B. Install AMA on the enabled machines. Associate DCRs that define and route guest telemetry. Use VM Insights for curated analysis, and use an alert rule linked to an action group webhook for notification. Option C. Use a DCR as the agent binary, VM Insights as the telemetry destination, and a workbook as the notification receiver. Option D. Install the legacy log analytics agent. Place a DCR in the same resource group without associations, and configure VM Insights to call the incident endpoint directly. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Install AMA on the enabled machines, associate DCRs that define and route guest telemetry, use VM Insights for curated analysis, and use an alert rule linked to an action group webhook for notification. AMA is the collection agent on each enabled machine. A DCR defines the data sources, transformations, and destinations, and its association applies that rule to resources. VM Insights provides curated performance analysis over collected VM data. An alert rule evaluates the condition, while an action group supplies the webhook notification path. Each component therefore remains within its documented boundary. Separate the hybrid monitoring chain into agent, collection policy, and association, analysis experience, condition evaluation, and notification endpoint. Question 49 of 50. After a branch network change, member servers intermittently fail to locate a domain controller. NLTest/DSGETDC sometimes returns error 1355, and Kerberos events report clock skew. No netlogon trust error or AD replication error is present. Which two checks isolate the two observed mechanisms before any account or replication reset? Option A. Reset every member computer account because error 1355 proves that each secure channel password is stale. Option B. Run repadmin/syncall and delete replication metadata for any partner that does not answer immediately. Option C. Verify that the members use AD-DNS and query the domain's DC locator SRV records from the configured DNS server. Option D. Use W32TM to inspect each member's time source, synchronization state, and offset from the domain time hierarchy. Option E. Increase max token size because a clock skew event indicates that Kerberos authorization data is too large. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are C and D. Option C. Verify that the members use AD-DNS and query the domain's DC locator SRV records from the configured DNS server. Option D. Use W32TM to inspect each member's time source, synchronization state, and offset from the domain time hierarchy. DC locator depends on DNS SRV records available through AD-aware DNS, so that check isolates the discovery failure. Kerberos clock skew evidence independently requires inspection of Windows time source, state, and offset. These actions are orthogonal. One validates name-based domain controller discovery, and the other validates ticket time requirements. Neither symptom, without supporting evidence, justifies changing computer accounts or replication metadata. Map each signal to its layer. Error 1355 calls for AD-DNS DC locator checks, while explicit clock skew calls for Windows time diagnostics. Question 50 of 50. An operator accidentally deleted one enabled user. During review, DCDiag also reports that one domain controller is not advertising sysvol, while repadmin shows replication error 2087 for that domain controller's inbound partner. AD recyclebin was enabled before the deletion, and the other domain controllers have a healthy sysvol copy. Which response sequence minimizes recovery scope and preserves diagnostic evidence? Option A. Perform an authoritative forced recovery first, then restore the user, and finally make every domain controller authoritative for sysvol. Option B. Copy sysvol from a healthy domain controller with File Explorer, force replication, and restore the user from system state in DSRM. Option C. Restore the eligible user from AD recyclebin. Diagnose and correct the 2087 DNS resolution failure. Then, if sysvol remains unhealthy on only that domain controller, use the documented non-authoritative DFSR sysvol recovery with a healthy partner as source. Option D. Delete the failing domain controller's metadata immediately, rebuild it, and recreate the user manually after replication converges. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Restore the eligible user from AD recyclebin. Diagnose and correct the 2087 DNS resolution failure. Then, if sysvol remains unhealthy on only that domain controller, use the documented non-authoritative DFSR sysvol recovery with a healthy partner as source. The deleted object has the narrowest supported recovery path, AD recyclebin. Replication error 2087 specifically indicates failure to resolve a replication partner's DNS name, so that cause should be corrected and replication reassessed before changing recovery state. If sysvol alone remains unhealthy on one domain controller while healthy copies exist elsewhere, that domain controller should synchronize non-authoritatively. There is no basis for forest-wide or multi-authoritative recovery. Choose the smallest recovery boundary first. Object restore, then the explicit replication error, then replica-specific sysvol recovery, only if it is still needed. You finished the monitoring and troubleshooting deep dive. Sort any misses by evidence source, isolation step, diagnostic tool, and remediation boundary. Replay only the patterns you missed to build a precise troubleshooting plan. Thanks for practicing with WebLizard's Cert Lab. Keep signals, scope, dependencies, and verification in view as you complete your AZ-802 preparation.